Stanley Davis sat in his office and looked through the daily reports for the umpteenth time, hoping to find at least some clue that could help him solve the most painful mystery in his life. The fact was that the man's mother went missing when he was 12 years old. Stanley lived with his parents in one of the Ohio towns at the time. The boy was used to the fact that there was never any scandals or misunderstandings in his family. And then, one day, Rebecca Davis went to the farm and never returned home. Meanwhile, not a single person knew where the woman had disappeared to, but she left behind her husband and a young child. Of course, search operations were organized after Mrs. Davis went missing, but unfortunately, they didn't yield any results. The 12-year-old Stanley took it the hardest. He loved his mother deeply, as she was the most important person in his life. Floyd Davis, however, grieved over the loss of his wife just as much as his son. They had a happy marriage and lived together for about 15 years. A lot of time had passed since Mrs. Davis went missing, but the wound in the soul of the elderly man still caused him much pain. If Stanley were asked why he went to serve in the police, he would probably answer without hesitation. "So I could find my mother, of course, either dead or alive." The detective never got tired of repeating. The mystery of his mother's disappearance had become the case of his life. Meanwhile, few of Stanley's colleagues knew the police officer had a secret that he rarely shared with anyone. The fact was that the man had a large mole on his wrist, which was shaped like a heart. But the unusual part of the situation was that Stanley's missing mother had the same mole on her wrist. That is why when Stanley Davis was looking through daily reports on all unidentified crime victims, he was most afraid to see the familiar mark. The man was well respected by his colleagues and subordinates. He had earned his reputation over the years of service in the police. Stanley was pulled out of his thoughts by the sound of persistent knocking on the door. "Come in," the detective answered, straightening his tie, which had fallen to one side. The department assistant stood at the door with the guilty expression on her face. "Mr. Davis, I'm sorry to bother you, but there's an urgent matter that needs your attention right away," Megan Garcia muttered. Stanley smiled reassuringly and lamented that the woman was addressing him too formally. Stanley felt this way because he was only a couple years older than his assistant, and therefore treated her as an equal, regardless of the fact that she was his subordinate. "Stanley, the thing is that a baby was brought into the station," Megan blurted out, mustering up her courage. "What do you mean a baby? Who brought him in?" Stanley asked in bewilderment. "I don't know. The officer on duty said that there were 2 homeless people. At least they looked like it. They said that they had found the baby in a carrier that was left by the trash cans," Megan answered, stammering at every word. Hearing Megan's answer, Stanley got up from the table and followed his assistant to the officer on duty. There indeed was a baby carrier, but it was empty because the officer was rocking the baby in his arms. "Oh my God, Mr. Mitchell, do you remember anything about the people who brought in this baby? Did you ask for their names or last names? Maybe they had some special marks," Stanley asked. They introduced themselves as Laura and Linda. "As for the special marks, I don't think so. Everything happened so quickly." They handed over the carrier and left. The officer answered, doing his best to remember as many details as possible. Stanley sighed in disappointment and went to the phone to call the orphanage and arrange for them to take the newborn. "Mr. Davis, wait. I remember. One of the beggars, she had a strange mark on her wrist. It was something like a mole in the shape of a heart," exclaimed the officer on duty. Hearing this, Stanley turned pale and nearly fainted. He felt dizzy, his mouth went dry, and he desperately needed a glass of water. Megan was standing next to him at the time. She looked at the detective with concern, but he had already overcome his initial shock and had pulled himself together. Stanley knew from experience that the probability of such a coincidence was equal to 0, and this meant that it was highly likely that his mother, who had disappeared many years ago, was at his police station earlier that day. But why did she look like she was homeless? And why did she use a different name? Stanley thought, trying to make the puzzles fit in his mind. But no matter how much he tried to figure it out, the young detective had no answers. The truth was that the only way to dispel the remaining doubts was to find the woman who brought the baby to the police station. But before starting the search, the man called his father to share the good news with him. "Dad, can you imagine? I got some information today about a woman who, judging by the description, might be my mother," Stanley said excitedly. "Son, many years have passed since your mother went missing. Have you ever thought that maybe she doesn't want to be found? Otherwise, where has she been all these years?" Floyd Davis objected. But Stanley was so carried away by his new piece of information that he didn't want to listen to any objections. He felt in his heart that it was his mother who came to the station that day. Unfortunately, he wasn't at the station at the time, and when he learned of the situation, it was already too late. While Stanley was talking to his father on the phone, Megan had already run to the pharmacy and bought formula to feed the baby. The baby was clearly hungry, although he did not show any signs of anxiety. "Well, isn't this better? Now you can go to the orphanage," Megan said with a smile when the baby was full. At the sight of Megan with the baby, some new, previously unknown feeling arose in Stanley's chest. The detective looked at the assistant with completely different eyes, in which admiration and tenderness could be read. Stanley has always liked Megan, but unfortunately, things didn't go beyond deeply hidden personal sympathies. In the depths of his soul, Stanley was afraid that his colleagues would condemn him for the office romance, and the detective didn't feel like he could risk it. At the age of 28 years, Stanley had never been married and was considered to be a convinced bachelor at the department. Realizing that he was running out of time, the young detective went outside in search of the two women who identified themselves as Laura and Linda at the station. Stanley reasonably believed that if the baby was brought to the police station, then the woman must live nearby, under the jurisdiction of his police station. In order to refute or prove this theory, Stanley went to the volunteer organization that provided assistance to the poor and homeless people who found themselves in difficult life situations. Sure, the detective was well aware that the chances of him getting any useful information there was extremely low. But to Stanley's great surprise, when he described the women to the volunteers, they began to nod happily. "Yes, we know these women. They are our friends, Linda and Laura. They live in an abandoned trailer home. It's parked at the end of the street," added one of the volunteers. Stanley's heart skipped a beat as he tried to process this information. Sure, he could be wrong about it, but the young detective was used to trusting his gut, and it was telling him that he was right. Approaching the trailer home, Stanley tensed up, preparing himself for the possibility that he would have to go through yet another disappointment. But when Stanley saw the young woman coming from the trailer, he couldn't contain his feelings and emotions. Mom, I've been looking for you for so long," Stanley exclaimed and rushed towards the woman, who was still his beloved mother, even though she looked different now. At first, the woman looked in bewilderment at the young man, who tried to embrace her with tears in his eyes. But then, something seemed to click in the woman's brain, and a spark of understanding lit up in her eyes. "You're so grown up, son," the woman muttered, looking at the mole on her son's wrist, the same one she had. A little later, when the initial emotion subsided a bit, they went into the trailer to talk in a more relaxed atmosphere. There, over a cup of tea, the mother's friend Laura told Stanley everything that had happened to his mother. As it turned out, Rebecca Davis made a huge mistake in her youth. Being married to Stanley's father, she fell in love with another man. Richard was a visiting businessman who planned to become an investor for one of the local farms. The affair with the successful businessman got to Rebecca's head so much that she seemed to have forgotten about everything else in the world. Their relationship was very passionate, and it was this passion that seemed to have swept away everything in its path and didn't let her think straight. It was then, in the heat of the moment, that Rebecca Davis made the fateful decision and left her family. Sure, it was very difficult for the woman to take such a step, but at that moment, her love seemed to be the most important thing in her life. Thus, she left her husband and her 12-year-old son. Having left for another city with Richard, Rebecca didn't even suspect that in a few years, her son would unknowingly follow her, but already as a police detective. Unfortunately, her life with Richard didn't go as well as she had hoped it would. But Rebecca tried to stick it out and didn't dare return home. fearing the condemning looks of her husband and son. 3 years later, Richard's firm went bankrupt, and he started drinking heavily and even beating on his girlfriend. Eventually, tired of the endless beatings and humiliation, Rebecca ran away from her tyrant boyfriend and ended up on the street. The woman wasn't willing to beg for alms and was desperately looking for a job. Unfortunately, it was then that Rebecca was mugged. The muggers beat her up and took her last money, and then left her to die on the street. But Rebecca's guardian angel did not abandon the unfortunate woman, and she was found by Laura, who lived in a trailer home nearby. She helped Rebecca up and led her to her home. Unfortunately, after the mugging and the injuries she sustained, Rebecca got amnesia, so she couldn't remember who she was and even her own name. For convenience, Laura started calling her new friend Linda in honor of her late mother. The two women helped each other survive in this harsh world where it was incredibly difficult to deal with all the hardships and problems alone. Laura and Rebecca would have probably continued to live in their trailer if one morning they hadn't found an abandoned baby near the trash cans. No one knew who the mother of the baby was, but it was clear that she wasn't going to take care of the baby boy. Now that Stanley had finally found his mother, after the long years of searching, he immediately called his father to give him the good news. Of course, Rebecca was very worried that her husband would condemn her, but Floyd stopped holding a grudge a long time ago. Moreover, Rebecca Davis had already been punished enough, having lived a significant part of her life in such difficult conditions. Returning to the police station, Stanley felt an incredible elation from the fact that he had finally solved the most difficult case of his life. But another piece of good news awaited Stanley at the police station. It was Megan who shared them with the detective. "I decided to adopt the baby. The truth is that I grew up in an orphanage, and I know firsthand what it's like. Therefore, my decision is final, and there's no way I'm changing my mind," Megan said, plucking up her courage. At that moment, Stanley's eyes sparkled with tears of joy and tenderness. The man realized that all his previous fears were absolutely groundless. In a fit of passion, Stanley hugged the young woman and kissed her gently. Apparently, even though the man worked side by side with Megan all this time, he didn't realize that she was secretly in love with him. However, Stanley didn't find out about it until much later, when he was already living a happy family life with Megan and their adopted son, Richie, who now got the best parents in the world who would never even think of abandoning him.